Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming out in the little bit of the cold today. Spend some time with us. Today's going to be a good day to reflect on where we were just a few years ago and how far we've come and what we need to go to the next level. You know, I looked back in preparation for Rob coming today, and I looked back at where we were around 2014 at the point of the warning coming in. We had challenges in our planning processes. They were not yet purposeful and systematic in pointing us towards student success. We really weren't following an effectiveness model that had its goals towards our core themes of student success. We were not quite fully engaged in student learning outcome assessment, and we didn't have program review and programmatic assessment, and we weren't quite fully asking yet, why isn't this working? So I think what was most disturbing when you look back, although it's good because then you'll see how far we've come, was we were at an all-time low for completion rates. We were between 9 and 11%. They were the lowest in the state and almost the country. Where are we today? Only 4 to 5 years later. We are actively engaged in program review. You're actively using data, good data, to address your decision making, and you're making good decisions. You're focusing on core themes. Everybody knows what they are. They talk about them. We're making processes and procedures that address them. We've hit our tipping point for enrollment. We're actually seeing enrollment starting to come back. The online is up, the social sciences, mathematics, arts. So this is great. What does it say? It says all that work you've done in the past few years is working. And here's the best part. Pat yourselves on the back. Your completion rate is up over 14%. I really mean it. That's wonderful. So I applaud you. So I want to acknowledge everybody that made these good things happen. But today is a day that we say we're just getting started. Using the data is critical, but it's not quite enough. You're going to hear a lot about using evidence. We need to look at the academic research and help us guide into our next direction. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. The research is fairly conclusive, and we're going to hear about that. The Academy knows how to help us increase our success rates. So we've read the research, and we're here to talk now with experts like Rob Johnstone. So I'd like to bring up Paul Jarrell to introduce our keynote speaker today. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I woke up yesterday morning and I thought, what's that white stuff out there? I hadn't seen that in over a decade, so I made it in. Had to be talked off the ledge a little bit driving in, but I survived. First of all, I want to thank Jennifer Fry and Jen Kepka for helping to organize this. It's a lot of work whenever you plan a multi-day event with someone who has as complicated a schedule as Rob does, so I appreciate their efforts, and I really want to thank Rob for fitting us in. Many of you are familiar with Rob. Rob was here, we were just chatting a year ago, almost to the day. He watched the Super Bowl last year down at a place with adult beverages downtown. So we were talking a little bit about that. So I'm really pleased that he's decided to come back. As you know, Rob has served as a director, a dean, a provost in the California Community College system. I've spent 20 years in the California Community College system and was really familiar with Rob and Rob's work, and it's really only been over the past couple years, I think, that I've gotten to know Rob a little bit better as a person and not just through his work. Having had a vision or a view of the community college system as a practitioner and then as a consultant, I think that really gives him a perspective that many people don't get. We usually see people on one side or the other in that regard. Since he's been a consultant, he has worked with I don't know, what's the number now? Close to 400 colleges around the country through many different initiatives from Guided Pathways, the Aspen Prize, A2I2, Gates Completion and Completion by Design, Lumina's Beyond Financial Aid, and many others. What's interesting, Rob has a connection to Eugene, and he has a connection, I think, to Lane. He did attend, proud to say, University of Oregon in the early 90s. Spent many times, I guess, a baseball fan, so spent many many days and evenings umpiring local high school, community college baseball, even did games here at Lane. And then started and ran for a couple years a men's senior baseball league, the Eugene chapter, which did have players, I think, from Lane on it, and as well as other area high school. So he does have a connection. What I've really been impressed about, having gotten to work with Rob more closely over the past couple years, is a true passion. And I think that the passion is really about trying to provide access to a way or a means for individuals to change their lives. And I think that is something that we lose in this when we talk about reforming education. We lose the fact that what we're really talking about is trying to create an institution that affords individuals that otherwise might not have that opportunity, an opportunity like many of us had, and that is one that allows us some social mobility and allows us to, you know, sort of change the direction maybe that we have for generations. And I think that's really, truly important. So I applaud you, Rob, for your work in equity and social justice. I think really that fits very well, I think, the culture at Lane and the work that we do here in trying to provide access, equity, and justice to our community. So I really want to thank you. So Rob, welcome back to Eugene. Welcome back to Lane, and thank you for helping us make our college a little bit more accessible.
All right, thank you, everybody. It is good to be back here. I got to grab my Diet Coke. Oh, that's the wrong one. It's early. I got in late last night, so what is it, February 5th? And I didn't start getting back on the road again until the second week in January, but I did a 10-day stretch right after that where I did 14,000 air miles and 1,500 driving miles around the U.S. to 7 states, including, my favorite part of that was I did a keynote in, actually not a keynote, I did a bunch of workshops at Batesville in Arkansas, a small college in Arkansas. Finished around 5:30 on a Thursday night and had a 9 a.m. keynote the next morning in New Orleans. Anyone knows that part of the country, those are not easy places to fly between. Only way to do that was to drive, so did an 8-hour drive after 8 hours and got up and did the next morning in New Orleans. And this week it was supposed to be easier this 10 days because I was supposed to go to El Paso, which is fine, Riverside, California, which is fine-ish, you know, it's Riverside, but fine. And I was supposed to hang out in Vegas for the weekend with my wife, who was going to fly in, and she also works with me for the Riverside Institute, then fly up here yesterday. It was going to be very easy. And then I live half the time in Connecticut, half the time in California, which, by the way, I would strongly suggest if you want to have something that's nice and easy lifestyle to have half your family in one place and half in the other. But she couldn't come out because of the polar vortex affecting the weather out there, and so I ended up flying on Saturday when we finished the Institute in California. I decided I hadn't seen her in like 10 days, so I would fly to Connecticut. So I flew to Newark, drove out there late Saturday night, watched the Super Bowl in Connecticut this time, and then yesterday turned around, went back to Newark and flew to Portland, landed around 9 last night. And I love Oregon, right? I really do. I was at grad school at Eugene here. But Willamette Valley people on the driving in the snow thing, that's not so good. Like the first half hour in Portland, it wasn't snowing bad on 5 once I got out of Portland, but the first half hour, like watching people slide around, you know, it's the classic people were either going 75 or 25. Yeah, I remember when I told people the rest of the country about Oregon, one of the things I loved when I used to do all these high school baseball games, I umpired all over like Crow and up in Harrisburg, and I had this thing I used to call the Oregon right turn, which is like if there are 2 lanes and you're in the right lane and a car's turning right on a rural road, these swinging out into the left lane to turn right. I'm like, this is something I've never seen before, but it's actually happened all the time. It's good to be back here. I know I was here literally a year ago to the day, and how many of you here were in a keynote session a year ago to the day? Yeah, that's what I thought. So what I'm going to do today is try not to retread too much ground. I am going to come back to the kind of equity and social justice thing I did last year for a little while. And I'm going to try to talk for about 40, 45 minutes here, and then really, by the way, and you don't need to wait to ask questions. I can't really see because some of the lights, if someone's raising their hand for a question, just shout, say, hey, I have a question. Happy to have that happen all the way through. What we're going to do in this kind of first keynote, I'm actually going to have you pull out your phones, and we're going to do an online poll. And this is kind of we're going to talk again about the urgency and the case for change in social justice and economic mobility. We're going to talk a little bit about some Lane data. Was Malloy in here, by the way? Where's back? Way in the back. Thank you, Malloy, for all of your help. You got some great data that lines up with some national data, so we have some comparisons to take a look at. What I'm going to do more in this session is share some of one of the big differences between last year and now is our friends at the Community College Research Center, CCRC, who I'll thank on the next slide, has started accumulating a lot of the early evidence. I mean, the guided pathways movement isn't that old. It's really, by most conventional definitions, started in 2011 with completion by design, and so there really weren't colleges rolling out guided pathways at scale until fall 15 or fall 16. So we've started to get some early evidence from those colleges. So I want to share that evidence with you, which will give you hopefully a reason for optimism. And then we'll talk a little bit about the kind of framework of guided pathways and answer some of your questions in here. I know we're doing some topic-based sessions throughout the day where we're going to explore individual pieces of kind of the framework of guided pathways. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about some of those big transformations. I'm going to show you a lot of examples from colleges around the country through web shots and other things, and we'll kind of explore some of the big questions in Guided Pathways Demystified. And I'm not going to talk much about it, but I also do this cohort model. You heard Paul mention A2I2, where I work with colleges over a 2-year period, and any information you want on that's also in these slides. So I also really, before I get going, want to do attributions. I think of CCRC, our friends at the Community College Research Center, as great allies to the field. They are not one of those research shops who likes to lob bombs over the fence at community colleges and tell us everything we're doing wrong without ever having stepped foot on a community college, which I could name some universities who do that. Certainly not the Ducks. They would never do that. But the CCRC has been doing this for 20 years now, providing research and a framework for us to understand the community college student experience, what are the challenges in that, and how do we optimize it going forward. And the thought capital behind Guided Pathways, I would argue, is about 80% from CCRC. Other things in this, and you'll see a lot of slides from CCRC in this from Davis Jenkins, and I'm very fortunate to work with a great group of partners, including AACC and Aspen, CESI, JFF, and SOVA. And again, big thanks to Malloy. And I don't know if he has a team, or if it was just him, but getting some data for this presentation as well. So let's go now. I want to take the pulse here a little bit. I like to kind of get you guys involved early. So why don't y'all pull out your phones, and you're going to go to Slido, SLIDO.com. And when you go to Slido.com, on the left there, you're going to enter the code ROB117. And when you do that, you're going to get the opportunity to answer the following question with one word. What is the first word that comes to mind when I ask you how you feel about guided pathways right now? I'm pulling out my phone because I have to run the polling system this way. And so go to Rob117. I always love when the first word shows up because it means this is working, which it does 99% of the time. By the way, there's no filter. If you get saucy, we're going to see it. I can't track you down as far as you know, but you guys getting in okay? Saying Rob117? Slow? Interesting. Internet slow? I wonder what that is. It's active. So let's see, give it a second here. Oh, there we go. Cool. All right, so I'm going to still log in here because I'm going to need to do something in a second. So let's see what we got. Trepidatious. Now, this is cool. I always love the kind of the creative among us who try to find that exact word that describes their soul as they think about this. It's always a lot of fun. Eager and excited, that's good news. So let's give it a couple minutes for these to come up here. Put that there. All right, what do we see in here? We've got eager, we've got excited. Apprehensive, let's call both sides of the question. Apprehensive, trepidatious, dizzying, streamline, ready, cautious, all there. Intrigued, timely, progress, hope. By the way, usually when I do this, there's a mix of the kind of, you know how this works with the word clouds. The words that are getting said more than once are getting emphasized. Eager, curious, and excited. That's pretty optimistic right there. I know this is a small sample size in this room. But that's actually a great start. And what I usually do this for is to point out that let's do it. Just ignore the kind of one-word thing. Just do whatever. Usually people will at least try to hyphenate it. Make up words with hyphenation. That's one of my strategies too. Yeah, so you guys got a lot of people who are eager, curious, ready, hopeful, excited. And I think the point about this, cautious is good, overwhelming. You've got a mix. You always see a mix between the optimistic. I got to tell you, I don't know that I've seen 5 bolded words that are all kind of on optimistic side of this very often. So you guys have a lot of energy around this. But it's also, patience is good. I like to think confused, patient, trepidatious, apprehensive. There's a mix here, right? This is what you would expect. We are, in fact, academics, right? Any issue that's got 99% of academics behind it can't be that important of an issue. Like, it just doesn't work that way. So it's actually, cautious is kind of coming up here, so that's good. All right, we're going to do one more poll question. I'm going to switch over to, this one's going to be multiple choice. And now this question, you're only going to answer A, B, C, D, or E. And the question is, which of the following statements best represents your view of why more students don't complete college? Is it A, 90% student issues, B, or 10% college control, B is 70-30, C, 50-50, D is, and this is the one thing I don't like about the software, is it changed, 30% student, 70% college control, and E is 10% student, 90% issues colleges control. Let's give that a second to come up here. And I'll explain why we're asking this question. Cool, I had about 35, 40 responses last time. Let me do this real quickly. This is often an interesting variable. As a former institutional researcher myself, how many faculty in the audience? How many student services? How many administrators can be both. How many administrators? It's actually split, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That's fascinating. All right, so what do we see here? What we see is, most of the people who responded last time, is you got a mix. Actually, this kind of sticks with my life that nearly everything's a bell curve, but it's not quite a bell curve here. But you've got 70% of you, 7 out of 10, saying it's either 50% issues that colleges control or 70. Throw in down here another 5. You got about 3 out of 4 of you that think that at least half the reasons more students don't complete are in our control. And you've got another kind of 20% there that believe that it's 30%. Why do I do this? Well, what I'm actually measuring here, at least in my words, is agency. It is the idea that you have the ability to affect change. So, by the way, I want to be really clear. I don't think there's a right answer here. I'm actually not judgmental about these answers. I think you can come at this a number of different ways and pick any of these 5. But I would tell you this. If 92% of you said A, I would refund your money and leave. Because there's no reason to try to do anything differently if the issues are all students, right? So we have a long history of blaming the student, right? And by the way, we also have a long history of every sector blaming the sector before it, right? Graduate schools blame undergraduate institutions for students not being able to write and think critically. Four-year transfer institutions blame community colleges for students not being ready, even though the data shows our students do the same or in many cases better than their native freshmen. We blame the high schools for underprepared students. The high schools blame middle schools. And the one universal about this is almost the one person we all blame for the lack of success is the student and often their parents, right? So we are very good at passing the buck down to a different system or to another system. Now, the good news is places like Lane, and I think the community college sector is one that, which is interesting, right? Because we'll talk about this in a second. Like, it's the system with the least power, the least funding, the least kind of prestige, who's been given the hardest business problem to solve, right? I mean, you heard I was a practitioner. I know this. I've been there. I spent 10 years on the ground. Like, I get this. Like, I can look at this from either side of this. And that it's intriguing to me that that system attracts the type of people who believes that we control the conditions for change, not all of them, but a lot of them, right? So when you look at this, even let's take A, B, C, and D, 93% of you believe that at least 1/3 of the reason more students don't complete are in the control of the college. Now, that has to operationalize what do we mean by in the control of the college. We'll talk about that, right? And over, like I said, 75% of you-ish think that over half the reasons more students don't complete are in the college's control. Why do I do this? Again, I think this agency, I will tell you, you guys know this, you guys started on this journey. This is not a short journey. Like the framework that has guided Pathways is trying to fundamentally rethink the student experience from when students are hearing about us to when they enter to how they progress and how they complete. And by the way, that we're going to track and see that they're successful after they're done here, right? We measure completion rates here as a great early first step to whether a student's successful. But if that success doesn't translate into either successfully completing a transfer, if that's where they're going, or having a living wage in the workforce, then even completion isn't enough, right? And we've largely not owned that part of it either. But completion's a great first step for that. But you guys believe you have a lot of control over this. That's going to be critically important as this gets harder, as you get closer to the things that are more controversial about guided pathways. And the case I'm hoping to make mainly in this session, again, is that you believe you have a sense of urgency over this. You believe we can't wait any longer. You believe this is about social justice. This is about equity. This is about economic mobility. And that you actually have some control over it. I mean, that's a powerful place to start from. And I will tell you, you will need to remind yourself of all of those things when this gets hard. I will tell you one thing that often happens. I don't know if I said this last year, but one of the things I find interesting is what often happens is, so I talk to a group of faculty sometimes in the morning, and the faculty hear about guided pathways, and they say, look, Rob, we love these ideas. This guided pathway stuff is great. If you can get the counselors and advisors to stop misadvising people, and you can get our administration to put mandatory X, Y, and Z in, guided pathways will work at Lane Community College. Then I go to the student services people in the afternoon, the counselors, the advisors, the support team. They say, hey, Rob, this guided pathway stuff is great. If you can get the faculty to actually map their programs, have some clarity about what students should take to get to where they want to go, and serve as triage for us for services, guided pathways will work here at Lane Community College. I am, by the way, a social psychologist, so you may hear some of this in here. We're really good at blaming the other group for problems. That will not work in a guided pathways framework. We're all going to have to look at what we do, how it intersects with what everyone else do. And what I would suggest strongly to you is the way to do that is to ground this in the student experience. What is it that we know from the data is not optimal about the student experience, either collectively because of I think I may have, oh, there we go, it's back. Collectively because of completion rates or select rates, or about individual pieces of the student experience. Those topic-based sessions we're going to have throughout the day, we're going to talk about more individual pieces of the student experience. But the grounding here of guided pathways is not one thing. It's a way to rethink that student experience. It's a series of big ideas, which we'll talk about. So don't lose this agency. So step one is make sure you believe you have agency, right? You know, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and hoping for a different result. You've just described somewhere between 50 and 800 years of higher education, right? The 50 being community colleges in most places, some places it's 70 or 80. The 800 being as long as we've had universities, right? We can argue about the history of universities, whether it was North Africa or Asia or Europe in the 12 and 1300s. It's all right around then, right? But it's a model, by the way, that was only designed for the rich offspring of the ruling elite, right? And what I'm going to make the case of now is that when we carry this model forward without changing it much, and by the way, I'll show you a couple of points of data, it still works great if you have unlimited time and unlimited resources. Higher education's wonderful in that scenario. I certainly didn't have that, and most of your students don't either, right? So that's what we're going to transition to now. But this is the point from here is a point of agency that you actually do have control over a lot of these things that are related to student success. So, all right, that's step one. Now let's talk again. I did a little of this on this last year. I'm doing it a little differently this time. Let's talk a little bit about economic mobility and equity. All right, so look, let's be really clear. We know higher education is about more than just economic mobility. Certainly, it may not be about more than equity, but it's about more than economic mobility. So what are the other things that we are very passionate about higher education representing for our students? What are some of those other things? What do we want to see in our students with their time with us? Yeah? Citizenship. And yeah, by the way, I have to be really careful when this particular one comes up. Oh, he's coming over. He's doing something. We're just going to let him do it. He's just watching him. Yeah, citizenship, right? So there's two kind of sides of that. There's the educated citizenry. I mean, we could make an argument you need a more educated citizenry today than we did 3 years ago, but I won't do that. We need an educated citizenry, right, to make informed decisions based on evidence. And also to produce, to be part of a society that we're all producing. Couldn't agree more. Citizenship, absolutely one of them. What else? Critical thinkers is my favorite. I love critical thinking, right? Couldn't agree more that critical thinking is one of the things we absolutely want to develop. For those of you who come later to the session on liberal arts and humanities, I'm going to make the case pretty strongly that we largely have not addressed this intentionally in higher education. We hope that it happens by osmosis, right? We're basically saying that if you take 21 courses with us, you will critically think. And I don't know how you backward design things, but if I'm trying to backward design a set of outcomes and include critical thinking, I got to A, know what I'm designing towards, which, by the way, we're very bad at. And it's critical thinking. And not to say critical thinking is easy, but the days of I'll know it when I see it as institutions are probably over for two reasons, accreditation, and, by the way, because society and industry is saying, we think you're struggling with this critical thinking thing. We want to know how you're getting better at it, right? So I love critical thinking. Look, I'm a social scientist. I love critical thinking. And I'm going to make the case numerous points throughout the next 2 days that our challenges in developing critical thinking are something we can kind of address under a guided pathways framework. And guided pathways doesn't solve all problems. It does give you an opportunity to rethink the student experience. And I'm fairly sure that if we were to start over and say, how do you develop critical thinking in 2 years at a community college and getting from what we think is largely point A to point B, we wouldn't say, just take a bunch of classes in any order, and no matter what you take, you're going to be able to think critically, right? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I think there's a piece of this where we get to own critical thinking that I'm actually really excited about, because you know as well as I do, whenever you do those employer surveys of your graduates, by the way, graduates from here, graduates from Harvard's, MIT's, surveys struggle with is not the discipline stuff. It's things like critical thinking and problem solving and creativity. They don't usually say citizenry because they don't think on that level in industry, but these are the things that come back. So I love critical thinking. What else? Self-efficacy. Say a little more. Like, what are you translating into what?
I think it's a combination of all the different things. Being able to advocate for yourself,
Yeah.
to part of that responsibility model of how you're going to get through life.
Yeah, so we're helping people navigate themselves and the systems with which they're going to interact. I think the other reason I asked for the clarification, sometimes that goes to another thing I think is important, is kind of a sense of lifelong learning, right? A sense that this is a process that doesn't end when you're with us. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We absolutely need to do that. Anything else? Yeah, creativity. So I was at Foothill down in California as the institutional researcher and the vice president of instruction, and it was during the kind of crazy part of the student learning outcomes craze, and during that session later, we'll all do therapy about that part of this phase. But we were doing the institutional learning outcome assessment, and we ended up with the 5 C's. See if this sounds familiar. Critical thinking, citizenship, computation, communication, and creativity. Those were our 5 institutional learning outcomes. Now, I will not tell you that we did a great job of assessing them or developing people on that, because Guided Pathways was not around then. And I do remember sitting there thinking, I'm glad we named these. I'm not sure how we're developing them aside from random course taking, but I'm glad we named them. I love creativity being in there. By the way, that's not a common one that people throw into this, and I'm a big fan of it for a number of reasons. So I would call those 5 C's, you can call them a set of institutional learning outcomes. I call them a liberal arts education, if you will, right? That is kind of what we define a liberal arts education to be. And that's going to juxtapose with whatever the student's discipline or major or degree or transfer is. But those are all really big pieces of what we do, right? You could argue, one of the other ones that comes up, by the way, I didn't hear here, what you hear at some other places, is a trained workforce that helps our community develop, right? And that's, I think you need, by the way, I'm going to make the case in a second, you need those liberal arts outcomes to actually have an educated and trained and flexible workforce. But the question that I always ask here, and I know I asked this again last year, what percentage of students attend your college solely for the love of learning? Right? To save some time, not many, right? We're hoping to develop that. By the way, the classic answer we get on this when I ask this in rooms is somewhere around, people guess 2, 3, 5% of students are actually here for the love of learning. And the thing I point out at the course is, why are we here? We're often here because we love learning. Like we are, especially those of us who are faculty or disciplined people or love the discipline, we are deeply invested in learning and lifelong learning. By the way, I think I may have told this story last year, but it's just so powerful. I had a college come up to me at a break and say, hey, Rob, I think it was an econ faculty from a college in Texas, and she said, I've actually been asking this question to all of my new students in my econ, whatever it was, 1A class, for 13 years. She had one of those surveys she gave on opening day, and this was a multiple choice question. It says, what's the primary reason you're here at the Alamo Colleges in San Antonio, Texas? And this was one of the 10 options. It was in the middle, kind of, because I love learning, or whatever the phrasing was. And so I was like, oh, wow, awesome. I actually can get some data on this. I've been guessing on this. I don't know what the answer is. 10 responses, what is it, 10%? Random chance would say it's 10%. She's like, percent? Not a single person has chosen it in 13 years. Like, oh my God, seriously, how does that happen? Like, I did the math, 3,500 students she had taught and take this, and no one had ever, now, you would have thought someone accidentally would have picked that bubble. Like, I mean, just random, that's like, I didn't know that was possible. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important, right? And I think this is our ownership is to say this is important. It is important that you have a sense of learning these liberal arts outcomes matter. But it's not why your students are here, right? I mean, the correlating question here is what percentage of your students are going to remain in academia? 1, 2? 97 to 99% of them are going to do something else, right? And going back to that 800-year-old model, by the way, the model is designed to create the next generation of academicians and researchers in your discipline. That is actually what the model was designed to do, right? To keep whatever it is we were studying going. We've actually done that very well. I mean, I think that's the huge success of the university model, and in America, we've gone even farther with innovation on that part of the model. The problem is, this is not necessarily much different down the road at U of O. Maybe it's 5 or 10% of undergrads there will go into academia, but it's not like it's 80, right? So the question is, how are we doing on the other part of the model? And that is, by the way, that 98% of your students are going to have a career that's not in academia and not in your discipline. If you include teaching, maybe it's 93%. Point is, most of them aren't here for that, right? Sandy Shugat, the president of Valencia, the first winner of the Aspen Prize, is very famous for saying, there's not a single student at my college of the 35,000 who are here who wants to stay here. They're all on the path to somewhere else. And whether that's directly entering the workforce now with a job with living wages as part of a career pathway that'll grow over time, or it's the first 2 years of transferring and going on and getting a doctorate degree. I want them to have their experience here. It doesn't lessen how important this experience is, but they're here to go somewhere else. And the question is, what impact are we having on their ability to get there, and how qualified they are or ready they are in the terms of transfer when they get to that goal. And just to be clear, I mean, I previewed this. You guys named our 5 C's pretty quickly. This doesn't mean a liberal arts education isn't important. I'd actually argue it's more important in 2019 than it was in 1969. And the reason is because people are going to change jobs 5 to 7 times now, and they didn't do that as much before. We're actually educating or training people for jobs that don't exist now, right? So if I switch from surgical technology to graphic design midway through my career, I guarantee you the last 8 classes I took in surgical technology will have exactly 0 to do with what I now need to do in graphic design. You know what is going to matter? Creativity, critical thinking, communication, citizenship. That stuff carries with you wherever you go. I actually think a liberal arts education is more important now. Now, I don't think that means we can just say, see, liberal arts education is important, don't do pathways. I actually think the opposite of that. See, liberal arts education really important. Let's make sure those 5 things we name matter. We know what it's like to develop them, and we have an idea of how students are going to get there. And that's the exciting part for me. I'm a social scientist. One of the exciting parts for me about guided pathways is taking ownership over how you develop critical thinking and how you create creativity. That's good. That's the lag of the flight. How you produce creativity in students, how you help them think critically. I think this stuff really matters. Now, but let's be clear about economic mobility. This is where I want to reframe this here, is that who is this most important to? It's most important if you're poor. If you're rich, your job is staying rich from an economic standpoint. One might argue we've created an entire society in America where that's actually the outcome, is so the rich stay rich. Now, if the poor are not even going to get rich, but they're going to move up the economic mobility spectrum, there's no better way, the data tells us this very strongly, of doing that than completing higher education. Doesn't work 100% of the time, right? I grew up in the lowest income bracket. If you rank the incomes by deciles from the top 10 to the bottom 10, I grew up in the bottom 10 with 2 parents who went to college. I was an anomaly. Usually when you have 2 parents who go to college, you don't end up in the bottom income bracket. But when you're in the bottom income bracket, economic mobility probably matters a lot more to you than creativity in the short term, because from a Maslow's need hierarchy standpoint, being poor kind of stunts the growth down the upper levels of the need hierarchy. And so I think the question we have to ask ourselves, and by the way, we're really comfortable talking about income level and socioeconomic status, and really uncomfortable talking about race. That was true before the last couple of years. It's more true now. And I would argue pretty strongly, as you may notice as a white male, that we need to take this on together and stop pretending that race and issues and income issues are independent of each other, because they're not. And I'm going to show you some data on this, but one of the factoids of this, there's not a single zip code in this country where on average, African American or Latino citizens have a higher median income than white citizens. That does not exist in America. Right? So if you believe in equity, you believe that we clearly have, it's not an even playing field, that we need to be able to talk openly about race. And again, I know where I am. I'm in Oregon, where you're 75% white here, and I think 60, 70% white, 15, 17% Latino, and a mix of other races. It still matters, right? Actually, some of the data I looked at, and what I thought was interesting when I was perusing it last night, is you don't have huge equity gaps here, especially between your two largest groups. They're there, 5 to 6 points, but they're not the 10, 15, 20-point gaps you see a lot of places, which is, I mean, a good place to start from. I'll show you some data on this in a second. So this is a project that I love the way it frames our mission a little bit. It's called the Equality of Opportunity Project. It's researchers from Berkeley, MIT, I mean, all these champions of the poor, you know, Stanford, Brown, MIT, although they're always very caring deeply about the poor. But this is a really interesting project. These are guys who looked at who ends up in what sector of higher education. Okay, great. So if we talk about the American dream a lot, we can debate whether it's alive or dead. We could do 2 hours on that, right? The American dream, you can define it a number of ways, but it's something along the lines of it doesn't matter where you're born, the color of your skin, the location you're born into, who your parents are, everyone's got an equal chance of succeeding. That's a characterization of the American dream. Right now, we could debate that on a number of lenses that look at it, but the one these guys looked at is access to elite private education. So theoretically, if we know, we do know this, that the Ivy League schools, and there's maybe 20 or 25 kind of schools in the country on the West Coast, places like Stanford, Caltech, to some extent Berkeley, where you go there and you have unbridled economic opportunity. I mean, I was an undergrad at Stanford, and I was a psych major. I was actually a human biology major, and then because of chemistry, I stopped being pre-med. So chemistry instructors, I wish I had you. But I like to say that the only people who are unhappy about this are malpractice insurance lawyers, that I didn't become a doctor. So I think the system did the right thing. I was a psych major, but I will tell you one thing. When I went on campus, like those couple of weeks in the spring, and in the quad were every investment banking, strategic consulting, and management consulting firm in America, all the top 5 of each of those categories saying, I don't care what your major is, you're here. Do you want to make $125,000 next year? Right? That happened in 1991. And it probably happened at the same 25 to 30 colleges it does now. Right? So this does matter, who gets into these elite institutions. Right? And if the problem we're about to see is what it does is it actually keeps the rich rich, in most cases, by doing this, because the poor don't have access to these institutions. Right? So it does matter who gets in. But the American dream should say, as Stanford, for example, if you looked at the economic distribution of parent-family income, like family income of parents, and broke it into 5 categories, top 20, second 20, third, fourth, fifth 20, you would see 20% of Stanford or Harvard's incoming student distribution from each of those 5 quintiles. If that were true, we could say, yeah, see, the American dream, at least as far as elite private education goes, is valid. Well, let's take a look at what the researchers found. And what they found was, and they used Harvard as the first example, is this. Here's what it actually looks like. Pausing for a second, 70% of the students, incoming students to Harvard, this is birth years 80 to 82, so this means they're entering Harvard 2000. The reason the study's about 4 or 5 years old, they were tracking economic outcomes forward, so they needed to do this long enough. They've done research since then to suggest that it has not changed much in the entering classes of Harvard since that time period, or these other colleges. And by the way, it's not Harvard's mission to do this. Nowhere in Harvard's mission does it say we want to provide equal access to students from low income and high income backgrounds. That's not what their mission is. But it's interesting to see what the net effect of our society of education results in, and what it results in is that 70% of people are from the upper income quintile, and in fact, 1 out of 6, 1 out of 7, are from the top 1%, which is almost more than the entire bottom 3 income quintiles, right? By the way, having been a student in this half of this income quintile Stanford likes to think it's an Ivy League school, it's not. It's a great school, don't get me wrong, I love my alma mater. Not as much as the Ducks, of course, but 2 alma maters. But I can tell you what it was like to be poor at Stanford. I mean, all my friends were talking about where they're going to go on, which island they're going to on spring break, or where they're going to go on semester abroad. and I was trying to shove a upside-down screwdriver into the flywheel of my 64 Dodge Dart to get it to start to go to work. Right? It's different, like when you're in that scenario, this scenario. Now, having said that, I had unbridled economic opportunity. Right? It took a while, I mean, a long while, but I got there. Right? So it is, by the way, when you look at the outcomes for those who get into Harvard, it doesn't actually matter what your income level is. You actually have the same economic outcomes, which is fascinating because the people on the right there started at a much different place. You'd expect a line of outcomes on like living wages to go like this. It actually goes like this. It's kind of straight across on the economic outcomes. So this matters. So it's not just Harvard, right? They added in the Ivy League, Chicago. I mean, I love the Ivy Plus new category. Why? The researchers were from those schools. They wanted to be in the Ivy League. I don't know. I mean, maybe just a hypothesis. There's a lot of stairs I can trip on here, just to, take a look at that. 15% of the students from those 13 institutions from the top 1%. Only 4% from the bottom 20, right? In fact, if I don't have this on this slide, but you are about 77 times more likely to get into Harvard if you're from the top 1% than if you're from the bottom 20, right? So the clear these are not the institutions that are solving economic mobility as a national problem. Okay, got it. So who is? Well, that's where we start here. We start looking at public flagships, right? So I didn't pick Berkeley. It's not a rivalry thing. I tell people that there are no real rivalries on the West Coast. You guys may have one of the real ones. Oregon State's a pretty good West Coast rivalry. But like Stanford, Cal, USC, UCLA, like you might be mad when you lose that night, but by the next morning you're like, we got good weather. It's all good. We got stuff we can do. I don't really care. Like I work a lot in the Midwest where Michigan, Ohio State, and like all those are rivalries. Does anyone care about Civil War 2 days afterwards in Oregon? I don't think so. We care that day. We're like, I mean, we beat Oregon State so often anyway, it doesn't really, I'm sorry. I know there's beavers here too, I get it. So anyway, researchers chose Berkeley. So I actually grew up in the Bay Area, and I thought, this actually surprised me a little, that Berkeley wasn't a little more egalitarian, but it is, it's a public flagship. It's still attracting the top kind of students, which is clearly correlated with income because of resources and educational systems and all those reasons. So it's not the public flagships either. And by the way, if you look around the country, it's not just Berkeley, you'll see U of O's income distribution is very different than Central Oregon or than Lane's. So if economic mobility isn't being solved by the public flagships or the privates, maybe it's the regional 4 years, right? And that's actually where you do start seeing. Now we start seeing here's where the poor students are actually getting access to higher education, which is great news. And then there's us, of course, right? There's community colleges. Cool. Great news from an access mission. We've hit a huge home run here. What's the problem with this slide in terms of actually changing intergenerational poverty or economic mobility? This is great from an access standpoint. But what else does this slide doesn't tell it, but what do we know about these types of institutions? Completion rates, right? Now, let's be clear. It's not hard for Harvard to have a 97% completion rate. You just take people with a 1530 on the SAT and 4.3 GPAs and let them go, right? So I'm not saying they're doing something special, although it's interesting. When you talk about the guided pathways, anyone had a son or daughter go to an Ivy League school or a Stanford recently? A relative? If they had someone in the room like that, the answer I would ask that person, so how long was the mandatory onboarding orientation before the first day of class? And the answer will be somewhere between 3 days and a week. Well, that's fascinating. So the Harvards of the world know that even though they're taking the top 0.2% of graduates from high school with the top SAT scores, that those students aren't ready for college. We take the top 100% and people coming back from people. And we, by the way, what's our onboarding process? If it's anything, it's an hour or two where we fire hose students of everything, right? So there's a mismatch here. The Harvards, the liberal arts institutions realize you need to acclimatize people into a culture, and those are students who already know a lot of the kind of cognitive stuff they need to do, right? So Harvard's doing a lot of work on the non-cognitive side. We're not doing much at all. That seems to be a pretty big mismatch since we're serving the 100%, they're serving the 1%. But what you're also looking at here is graduation rates, like 95% at the elite liberal privates. The public flagships range from the upper 60s to the low 90s, depending on the state. The regional 4 years, now you drop down to the upper 20s in some states, to the low 60s. And community colleges in 2 years, because those are all 4-year rates, 2 years in community college, if you add transfer plus certificates of 1 year or more, you get a number around 35%. Right? So if I was a conspiracy theorist, I would say we've set up a system that keeps the rich rich and the poor poor. Maybe not intentionally, but that's the net outcome of these systems. Now, I'm not blaming us, by the way. That's the last thing I'm doing. I said earlier, hardest business problem, least resources, least attention, right? We've got the hardest business problem. The positive note here is if anyone's going to solve this problem, it's going to be us. And the good news is, in the first set of slides, and the polls, you believe you have agency to help solve this problem. You've got agency, you've got urgency. When I look at this, if you're going to work on intergenerational poverty, and by the way, I actually don't particularly care which reason motivates you. Whether it's economic mobility, whether it's a sense of social justice, whether it's equity, whether it's an educated citizenry, whether it's a series of liberal arts outcomes you want to see play out later. Whatever, and by the way, it could be all of those, whatever motivates you there keeps you at the table to do this work. And you need to not lose that sense of urgency, that's what you're working on. I travel the country constantly. I spend like 200 days a year on the road. And I end up, as Paul may have mentioned, I end up at a lot of sports bars I've earned this, by the way. Great beer all over the country. I know this is Beer Town at one point. I've actually been to most of the beer towns for work. Grand Rapids, Asheville, San Diego. I'm very often in places where I'm watching the game, having a beer, and I have my computer and a Hawaiian shirt, so I'm at least visually a fairly interesting person to talk to. And they talk to me, they're like, oh, he's actually an academic. Oh, that's not good. So bartenders, waitresses will talk to me and say, hey, what do you do? And I tell them, well, I get to travel around the country. I work with mainly community colleges or regional 4-year schools to try to help them improve the outcomes of their students so more students complete and get jobs with living wages and transfer with junior standing. Can't tell you how often the person in that room is tied to that community, right? They work at Lane. They went to Lane. They go to Lane, right? So one of the things that happens here, there's a story I'll tell later. The first part of this story is about part-time students. But then they ask me what I do. And when I say that, I say, that means that what I'm doing is I'm working on social justice and equity issues, right? But so are all of you. Being able to say, you could say that same thing I do about what you do. You work on conditions that try to help students get through Lane and go on to something bigger, and whether it's transfer at U of O with junior standing, that leads to a living wage, or it's a career directly they enter. That's what you work on. You're working on all of those things. So don't lose that. It's easy. Look, Don Kennedy, I think he was quoting someone else, former president of Stanford, was very fond of saying, we too often let the urgent get in the way of the important. Urgency doesn't go away, like the urgency we have with the day-to-day things, but to not lose the larger purpose of why we're here is so critical. And so just some further evidence of this challenge before we start showing some of the data. This is one of those ones that it's just shocking to me when you actually look at it. Here's like one of those factoids you get released by USA Today or comes across your wire. And it says, hey, great news. From 2013 to 2016, the median net worth increased 46% for Hispanic families across the country, 29% for black families, and 17% for white families. That seems great, right? If you're black or Hispanic, things have gotten notably better. But as stewards of data and critical thinkers, what is the question you want to ask now? Where did they start? That's a fairly good question. By the way, I love the way we when I came to U of O in 1993, I taught undergraduate statistics, and one of the books I would use was, I'm going to forget the guy's name, maybe Huff, Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics, right? Great book. We can misuse anything. By the way, this is completely true, but if you don't ask that second-level question, you get a pretty false interpretation of what this is telling us. I'm actually not even going to answer the question you asked, is where do they start? The question I'm going to answer is where do they finish? After the increase. Here's what it looks like. In 2016, after the increase, if you are white in this country, your median net worth is $171,000. If you are Hispanic, it's $21,000. And if you are African American, it's under $18,000. All right, so pause there for a second. So that's after the increases, right? So we can say this is about income, and we won't be wrong. There's rural white poverty, there's white poverty in the there's white poverty everywhere, right? That happens. But disproportionately, when you're talking about income level, you're not talking about an even distribution between the three primary races in this country, right? We're not starting from the same place. To me, this even further sharpens our mission, right? Some other data on this. is when you talk about one of the places we lose our students to is for-profit institutions, right? We're going to talk later about why that is, right? They're attracted by a value proposition we have but don't advertise and don't deliver on. They don't deliver it on it either, but they advertise it. But students going to for-profits, that's a big problem. Not all for-profits are the same, right? But take a look at those loan default rates. If you go to a for-profit versus a community college, your loan default rate within the first 12 years after you attend that institution is double. 52 versus 26. But that's actually nowhere near the worst part of this. Look at the second one. Because you got to take loans more often if you're going to a for-profit. If you look at students entering either of these two institutions, it's almost 4 times as much, 47 versus 13. Now start looking at it by ethnicity, and it gets even worse. And this is like, this top one is about, if you want one data point to give you a kind of state of how things are in education in America, if you are a white student who doesn't start at a for-profit and completes, by the way, this is an old version of this slide, you only have a 4% loan default rate in the first 12 years. If you're black, you don't complete, and you're at a for-profit, your loan default rate is 67%. Just pause there for a second. I mean, that is absolutely insane, right? And these are institutions that are supposed to be helping people on the path to economic sustainability, right? And I'm not, by the way, you could have worked at a for-profit and be a very good person. I'm not actually making value judgment, although, I mean, there is that. I mean, anyone know what University of Phoenix's 6-year graduation rate is? It's 18%, right? Which actually, I don't know if I did this last year, because I don't remember where I was last week, much less last year, but I always have a new motto that I think we could use. That's fail with us, it's cheaper. No, maybe, come on, it was just a joke. Look, you're much better off not completing at a community college than you are at a for-profit institution. It costs 10 times as much, right? So the point of all of this, again, is that this matters. It matters to everyone. What I'm about to show you on the next slide is a slide on, all right, so let's talk about college graduation rates by income. Okay, so we know about the access problem. We know about loan rates. Here's another national factoid. And take a look at this. So what you have here is college. This is not college-going rates. There's a whole separate body of research on college-going rates by income level. Of course, people on the higher income levels go to college more. This is of those who go to college, right? So this is a very interesting and disturbing slide. And this is actually, and I'm not a big fan of test scores, although this suggests they're fairly predictive. This breaks these 4 categories, richest, upper middle, bottom middle, poorest, into below average and above average test scores. Now, one thing that's really important about this slide is those below average and above average are not relative to that quartile, meaning that the high-performing poor students are actually not as qualified as the high-performing rich students. They're actually the same. Same test scores. And so I've shaded these 2 boxes for a reason. So what this tells us is that if you have below average test scores and you're from the upper income bracket, you actually have a higher college completion rate than those who have above average test scores from the poorest income bracket. I mean, income matters, resources matter. If we don't change the system, this is what we get, right? Still say it again, unlimited time, unlimited resources, you do well in higher education. And by its way, it's not the case that no one from down here gets there, but when I look at this, the other thing I look at how the fact that these 2, by the way, are the lower income bracket and above average test scores have a roughly only 1 in 3 of those students complete college, right? So there's a couple things going on here. There's a financial stability argument, there's a student financial stability, but there's also how important this is, because this is untapped resources. This is the group, you want to improve your completion rate, you're not finding a bunch more students up here. Right? You're not getting those. You never had more than you do now of those. What you need to do is get these students first to be the ones who complete. And by the way, if you do that, you're not only going to be working on economic mobility, because of the previous slides, you're going to be working on equity and social justice, because this matters by race. This is highly correlated by race as well. So again, I look at all this and I get a deep sense of urgency from this work, and I already had that before I came. And I will be really clear to you. I did not come to higher education to work on social justice and equity. I mean, how many of you did? Right, so there's about 10 hands raised in the room. I didn't come for that reason. I don't think I'm lesser or greater. By the way, thanks to those of you who did. But that's what we're all working on, right? You may think you have a small piece of it. You teach one small range of classes. But to our students, that all is a tapestry that needs to get woven into something that has outcomes for them that matter. And this is telling us we have a lot of opportunity to change those conditions so that more of those students succeed. And so let's look at your data now. So that's national data. It frames the issue. We know that we have issues with economic mobility. We know that we're not maybe serving the lower income brackets as well. This is now about this, looking at some national data and lane data around completion. So I told you the Guided Pathways movement first came around in 2011. Our goal, we're just checking the time, was to improve completion and post-graduation outcomes. But no one wants to wait for your completion rate for 6 years to really understand. Hey, great news, the 2013 cohort just came out of our 6-year completion rate. Nobody cares, right? I care as the researcher, Malloy cares, these people care. But everyone else says, yeah, well, that doesn't mean anything. We've changed a lot since then. By the way, historically, that statement has been completely untrue in terms of outcomes. We said it every time we got a new piece of data from 4 or 6 years ago that we've changed a lot since then, and the completion rate stayed the same for a very long period of time. I mean, you guys have had some increases, modest increases, a lot of room to go, but that's unusual, right, to have those increases. I think in the last 5 to 7 years around the country, we're seeing more of this, and I think it's a combination of things. Better data, a lot of the things you mentioned earlier, kind of guided pathways work, some rethinking of developmental education, a lot of things have happened. But the point here is no one wants to know what happened 6 years ago. So CCRC and I and some others had to kind of work on a shorter set of indicators that are highly predictive of the long-term completion rates, and we were able to do that. CCRC primarily did the kind of back-end statistics on this. But these momentum metrics, as CCRC calls them, there's a paper, by the way, if you want to look this up, why they matter for college improvement. But these momentum metrics, especially the two that I've starred, these college-level credit thresholds, those are semester unit, by the way, so the translation into quarters I'll do in a second. But if, for example, quarter units, you guys know that if it's 90 units after 2 years is what it takes to graduate and hopefully transfer with junior standing, where in the perfect world would they be after 1 year? 45, right? Now, you may guess that not many of them are there. I'm about to show you not many of them are there. That's true nationally, whether you use semester or quarter units. But even these other thresholds, so 15 kind of semester units translates to about 22.5 quarter units. 24 semester translates into 36 quarter units. If you measure those after 1 year, they are highly predictive of whether someone is going to complete. The second set is on gateway math and English completion, right? Do you finish, in your case, gateway math? Other states look at college level or transfer, and Malloy told me about the distinctions here. It's fine. I mean, we look at slightly different everywhere. But on the national scene, it's more the college level math course, and in California, they even do transfer level math course. Achievement of that in the first year is also highly predictive of success. These other ones are a little less predictive, but they're there. Kind of the fall to spring persistence, course level pass rate. Unreleased kind of study that CCRC is about to share in the next couple months. If you look at it, there's one other variable they have in there, and I don't remember what it might be concentrating, those who concentrate in their first year. They use those 8 variables to try to predict 3- and 6-year completion. And they found that with just using these variables, you could predict 80% of the variance in completion. Math people in the room, you don't get R-squareds of 0.8 very often. That's insane. And if you add in a series, I think he said 45 demographics about the student, race, income level, everything else. If you add those in on top of these 8 variables, it only adds 2 or 3 points of predictability. These things matter. They're going to release this study later this year. This is hugely important for a couple of reasons. One, we picked them. We needed to know that they worked. And 2, because they're that predictive, if you can move the needle on these, you're moving the needle on downstream completion. And you can measure it after 1 year, which is important for keeping kind of momentum going. So the point is these matter. We've got evidence that they matter, and there's more evidence coming out. And now we can look at some of the things that we see around the country on these metrics and also show where you are here at Lane. So these slides, so I want to, before you see the next slides, I'm gonna play Malloy on TV here. I would tell you, as I'm sure he would, that there's a tendency when you see yourself and other colleges on a slide to immediately compare. I want to know what that other college did or that other system did versus us. I'm not going to tell you to not do that because you're going to do it anyway. But what I would tell you is to also think about the absolute achievement of those outcomes, right? For example, on one of these, you're 33% higher than the state average in California on one of these metrics. But that's 4% versus 3%, right? So you tell me, yay, we're that much better, but 97% of the students aren't reaching that bar, right? So think about these in an app. I will help with this because this is a point I want to hammer home. All right, some other things. I have data coming from a New York college because I happened to do a keynote there and I got the data. From Maricopa, the 10 colleges in Phoenix who are part of my A2I2 cohort represent 225,000 students in the greater Phoenix area, 10 colleges with individual accreditation. I happen to have the Connecticut system data and the California system data. The second bullet here is that one of the high predictors of these outcomes is the percentage of your entering students that are full-time. Now, you guys, compared to where I come from in California, where Paul comes from in California, you guys are much higher on the full-time students. 60, 65%. In California, the state average is 35%. In Connecticut, it's 55, Maricopa 60. So having about 2/3 of your students full-time matters. Like, that's a big deal. I've never seen that college in New York is the highest I've ever seen. I have no idea. By the way, it is not in an economically advantaged area of New York. I don't understand how 86% of their students are full-time. I want to go do a case study on that, because that is highly correlated with downstream success. The other thing is that you're the only college on this system on quarters out of all the data I have. So some of the translations, I'm going to call them out as I go through them, it doesn't matter. Others, I think it does. I'm not actually sure which direction it predisposes one to believe you'd be higher or lower. We could explore that together. So those are kind of the caveats. And here's the first one. Here's the number of students who get, this one shouldn't matter whether it's quarter or semesters, because now we're talking first term metrics. How many students complete 6 or more college level units in the first term, or 12 or more college units in the first term? So on the 6 or more, you guys have about 57% of your students. So remember, there's 2/3 of your students are full-time, so they're taking at least 12 units. And just over half of them are completing 6 of those units at college level. Now, that's an important phrase here, college level, right? Because if they're taking dev ed courses, those don't count. So these are college level courses. Getting dev ed units is not predictive of downstream success. In fact, having dev ed units is a negative predictor of downstream success. Cause and effect thing there we'd have to explore over beers. I don't think that actually means that taking dev ed courses leads to lower outcomes. It's more of a recognition of who's in dev ed courses. We have a whole body of data on math and English reform, which I won't have time to go into today. But you guys are, you're doing fine on that. You're higher than the California average. But coming to 12 units, given that so many of them are taking 12 or more units, this number's a little lower. So this means 4 out of 5 Lane students in their first term don't achieve 12 or more units. Now, you know as well as I do, 12 is actually not the bar for being perfectly on path for 2-year graduation. That would be 15, right? So we're not even there. We have that whole 15 versus 12 thing, which we can talk about later. So this is, again, you're not out of whack with some of these other colleges on this one. I think the question here is more of the absolute question. So now the year-long units. This one is a little weird for you guys because the rest of them are on the kind of 24, it's 30, 24, and 15. We used 18 or more college level units, which would actually be equivalent to 12 semester units. So your bar is lower than the ones you're comparing to there in the first one. But you're seeing about half of them get 18 or more college level units in the first year. So do the math on that, right? That means that 90 is what they need to graduate or transfer, right? So that means only half of your students are 1/5 of the way there at the end of the first year. Keep going. 7 out of 8 of the students are not just over 1/3 of the way there after the first year. And I said down at the bottom here, I actually think you guys, it's harder to get to 45 in 3 quarters than it is to get to 30 in 2 semesters, because it requires an extra semester of persistence and success. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in this being, but by the way, it's all low, right? That college in New York, by the way, 87% of their students are full-time, and only 1 in 10 are on path at the end of the first year, perfectly on path, right? So this, I think the point here is, if I'm Lane and I look at this slide, where I land is here. This is probably the most important bar, because this is a low bar. They're only 20% of the way toward finishing. This is kind of a 1/3-ish. I know it's not exactly 1/3. It's a little more than 1/3. 7 out of 8 students aren't 1/3 of the way there. And by the way, what we know about this data is it's not like they catch up later. Right? They don't all of a sudden later get momentum. Some of them do, but on average that doesn't happen. So that's where kind of we are on those thresholds. And then passing college level English and math in year 1. So you guys are program level on this slide. The other ones are college level. And you guys know that Malloy was about 1/3 of your programs on the CTE side that makes a difference in?
1/3 of the students for CTE and all but a couple of CTE programs require below 100 level.
Right.
Counts here.
Right, so I'm of two minds about this, right? Because we're talking about CTE students, we already know their success rate is much higher, right? So I'm not totally sure this discounts this slide very much, but it is important that you are program level and the others are college level. Just know that as a backdrop. So what does this say? College level, or in your case, program level English in year 1, 2 out of 5. Do that in year 1. Math is 3 out of 10. Now, by the way, California uses the transfer level because, again, CTE is kind of weak in California as an aggregate. There's nowhere near 1/3 of the students in the California community college system who are CTA-based, except from a couple community colleges. But we use transfer level in California, and that's next to nobody gets there after a year. By the way, this is call it what you will, Dev Ed reform, math and English reform. The movements that have been going on around the country, co-rec and acceleration, I'm about to show you some data from other colleges, have shown vast movement on these variables. There's a college in California, this is the state rate, 25 and 10, Cuyamaca College, it's in the San Diego area, who's gone fully to co-rec math and English, right? And as you know, California is a faculty-led state. That was a great, interesting study of how they got there. These numbers are both in the high 50s now, right? So the reform efforts in those areas of math and English, there's very good evidence of seeing these. We're starting to see them even better at scale. Then the kind of fall to spring persistence, this is fall to winter persistence for you and fall to spring for everyone else. That's fairly common. It's a little lower in California. And then term 1 course completion rate is fairly consistent. That actually doesn't really change that much over time. So I look at this, and by the way, here's some interesting things. Malloy was able to get me data from over a period of time. If you look at a 5-year period, I mean, Marge, you were talking about this, like the improvement you've seen over a 5-year period on some of the outcomes. All of these predictive metrics have gotten a little bit better over that time, right? Kind of college level metrics in year 1, the 36 has gone from 10 to 16, you've doubled the 45. Program level math especially, look at the difference there. That's a huge jump. I mean, I'm sure there's a reason for this we could talk about later, what the specifics were of that. And this has gone up as well. This doesn't tend to move much, like you're not gonna, that's not something that moves. But this is actually interesting, getting 6 points there. So the good news is you're starting from a foundation of these moving in the right direction. Right? And by the way, Malloy has this data broken down by ethnicity. I didn't want to produce 18 slides on it. But what I said earlier is true on most of these variables, that there's a 4, 5, sometimes a 0-point difference between, for example, white and Latino, who are the 2 largest groups. There's some places where it's bigger, but on average, it's not what I've seen much bigger gaps at other colleges. Then I pulled off the 150% graduation rate from the Chronicle for Higher Education, just from you and a bunch of other Oregon colleges, kind of Clackamas, they're alphabetical through Umpqua, and then the average in Oregon, California, and Washington. So you can see you were at 10. I think you're up to a little higher than this now because this data is a year or 2 old. It's moving in the right direction. There's some trends in Oregon. The highest one in Oregon, actually, there's a couple of the small colleges that are in the 20s and 30s. But these are all reasonable-sized colleges. I tried to do that by Oregon standard. I know Portland's like 8 times as big as everyone else. But I thought these were relatively, from my Oregon knowledge, representative. So we've all got a lot of work to do is the point here. Systemically, by the way, the average in Oregon is 16%. The average in California is 26%, Washington 29%. Right? So the point of all this is you've got room to grow. This is the baseline from which you look at this stuff. You can spend time, by the way, we could spend time exploring why these metrics are flawed, because all metrics can be explored as flawed in some way. What I think hopefully you're seeing from all of this data is a picture of kind of where you are now and why it's so important. Malloy, I want to give you anything you would add to this now as you kind of look at the data?
Just you could just said one of the particular issues with flaw is when you compare institutions to institutions. For example, iPads rates. You often go to a different set of data that operates under different rules. iPads rate.
Absolutely right.
Right here, it may be apples to oranges because this was included, but also when we even go to iPads, the rules for iPads are
35 pages long. Yes.
Down to individual researchers, individual
right.
Over time, crunching the numbers.
Exactly.
A lot of room there for one college to do it a little bit.
Right.
So take 10 comparison across.
I agree with that 100%, especially on this slide. Like, because this slide takes all of those idiosyncrasies and the ways they do it are kind of rolled up into this. I mean, I don't think any of us should be happy about this. That's the global thing. When you come back to these slides here, especially this one, like, this is pretty straightforward. Like they're done, we actually created the methodology, so we asked colleges to do it similarly, and Malloy did it here as well. Like that's why I think this particular thing right here, I mean, you can look here, here, here. That's really important, and these two are really important, even knowing that yours are program level. Any questions about the data before I move on to some of the trends in the national data? Yes, sir.
Thank you for sharing this with us, and I was wondering if you would come back and talk to our state legislature.
Yeah, I've actually, I get asked that a lot, my friend. I actually would be happy to. There are people better at talking to legislators than I am. I tend to get frustrated with them over time because they underestimate the challenge. They and some of my foundation friends who, by the way, in many cases, the legislators maybe less so. The hearts are in the right place. But if you let legislation get involved in this, like look, many examples currently in California, in Texas, and Florida, if legislators are making your rules, they're not going to be nuanced, right? They are not going to have a lot of nuance to them. So, and I'm glad you brought this up because Oregon, I don't think has had a lot of draconian top-down legislation governing you about things like dev ed reform or other things. It's coming. If you don't work on the problems that are represented in this slide on your own, and the good news is you guys clearly are, you've gone from 21 to almost 40 on the math side over that time period, that if you don't work on them on your own, your state will legislate this for you. I said this like 3-4 years ago, like the data on these acceleration and co-rec models is just too strong for some state legislator not to go, wait a minute, you guys are doing something that has a 20-25% success rate, it costs taxpayers more and the student more, it takes longer, and is a barrier to completion. I got this thing over here which works 2 to 3 times as well, costs the taxpayer and student less, and you're still doing it this way? I don't think so. And I predicted 3 to 5 years ago we had a 5 to 7 year window where even the last states would be legislating this, and I assumed that California would be one of the last ones to legislate this. Turns out I was very wrong about that because AB 705 in California says that all students must be able to complete transfer level math and English within 1 year. And you will implement that by fall of 19. That's what happened in California. Like, think about that. You guys know the California community college system, that all those stereotypes are true. We were crazy. Doing good work. Like, things don't move that fast in California. They're moving fast now, right? And it's, again, there's always new. I heard this something over the weekend at this institute, and I'm like, this is what I'm talking about. They screwed up one key piece of this, and it looks to me like now like they're not allowing acceleration models of 2 semesters unless you can prove that data is better than the 1 semester model. So I'm glad you brought this up. My advice here is don't sit by idly because this is coming. And whether it comes tomorrow or in a year or 3 years, if you let them do it, you know they're going to screw something up. They nearly always do. Good-hearted people, right? They almost always screw it up. Other questions about the data? Yeah?
Earlier you were talking about what motivates our staff and administration, and largely it's not data. And there's an abundance of data. So how do you have examples of colleges that have been effective in using data in a way that sustains reform initiatives and gets people engaged at the right levels?
It's funny you mentioned this because on Thursday I led a pre-conference session where 1/3 of so about a half hour was on how do you create a sense of urgency around this work. And I had created categories. There's quantitative data, there's qualitative data, there's calls to social justice, equity, and economic mobility. And of course the answer is all is the way to do this. It is absolutely true, and I'm as a former quantitative researcher very aware of the fact that data doesn't motivate everybody, right? There's a lot of qualitative data to this as well. There's a lot of students, in fact, in some of the breakouts, the topic-based sessions, I have a whole 15 slides of student quotes relevant to the pillars from focus groups at colleges around the country. And while they're not from Lane, you should ask yourself when you hear some of those if they aren't from Lane, right? Because the things that students experience, we all think our students are unique snowflakes compared to every other student in the country. This is the one thing I can tell you from having worked with 400 colleges, is that is largely not true. Individual area, so here's what is different amongst colleges, is your improvement trajectory, your history, your service area may differ in terms of who's there, like the income level, the ethnicity. The problems in front of students who attend a community college are nearly the same everywhere, right? So I do think that when you hear more of the qualitative stories, pathwaysresources.org, a wonderful resource that the National Project put together, where you can look at the graphic I'm about to show you and actually click on each part of the graphic. It'll bring up case studies and papers and then videos from students talking about that topic. That matters. The only answer to the question is I do think that that's why I spend so much time on social justice and equity, that you have to start there and end there. And the rest of it is just framing of those issues that you're working on. Because I've met very few people who work at a community college who don't care about some combination of those 5 things I mentioned. And we, the National Pathways people, did a bad job early on. We assumed everyone knew that's why we were doing Pathways. That was a horrible assumption. And for 3 years, when I did Pathways keynotes, I started here. Here's what Guided Pathways is. Here are the 4 pillars. Like, we didn't have this slide, but I started somewhere like this. I explained what Guided Pathways was. Reflecting 3-4 years later, I realized what a horrible mistake that was, because now you're immediately into the, well, I don't like that part, that part, that part. If you frame it as what you're talking about, that sense of urgency, the data does matter. The experience of students does matter. Look, if you guys had an 85% completion rate, I wouldn't be here, except for when I was wearing my Aspen Prize hat celebrating you, right? But you and the most of us don't, so we have room to grow. It's an excellent point about how do you motivate people to come to the table. And look, it's not like you people were looking for things to do, right? We are the most under-resourced system. Everyone's already doing 2 or 3 jobs. Like, there's a piece of this, like, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, how do we reframe this so it's not doing more? And I'm tired of hearing we're going to do more with less. Like, that whole argument is complete BS, right? We got to, I think one of the questions, whenever I do an Aspen Prize visit, I've been fortunate enough to do like 27 of the 50 finalists on the Aspen Prize, including Santa Barbara. I was on that team. One of my favorite questions to ask is, what did you stop doing in the last 2 years? That's actually a fascinating question. By the way, most colleges struggle to answer that question. And why did you stop doing it? If they did stop doing something, most often the answer to why is the person got tired of leading it or they left. That's actually not the reason you want to stop something. You want to actually know whether it's effective. Is it having an impact? Can we elevate the scale, rethink it, or stop doing that because we got all these other things we could be doing? So, I mean, any of you think you don't go to enough meetings? Right, you go to more meetings than you want to, but what are we doing with those meetings? Are we using those meetings for change? Great observation. This is the Guided Pathways model. I showed you this last year. We'll explore this more in the afternoon session and in some of the breakouts, but I want to just point out kind of these 4 big ideas of Guided Pathways. Last year, I think I did this Family Feud thing. You guys may remember where I set up this kind of why these things matter. What are the questions that students ask before they get here? Is it a problem that they don't know where they are or where they need to go? Why are students so successful? When you look at the reasons students are so successful, like athletes and cohort-based CTE students, you see things that are fascinatingly this foundation for this work. You see things like clear course paths. You see mandatory support. You see peer support. You see a chair or a coach of a program who's invested in the student's success. You have highly motivated students. You have an end in mind they're motivated towards. All of those reasons that make, for example, athletes in community college cohort-based CTE students so successful are the foundation of the Guided Pathways movement for the rest of the students who don't get them. How do we clarify the path so we can actually map the programs and so students know what they need to take to get to where they want to go? Right? Cohort-based CTE programs have been doing this all for a long time. No Surge Tech students wondered what they're taking in the 3rd semester. They know, right? But if I'm a psych student, or even better, a student in a Psych 1 classroom, because that means I could be either a psych major, I could be a student taking a gen ed course in psychology, or I could have no idea why I'm in there. My experience, by the way, that's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in the Psych 1 class from having taught it. That's a very different story. These things matter a lot more to me. I don't know where I'm going. I mean, one of my favorite things to ask you is to play this scenario out in your head. If you had 10 students out of a Psych 1 class who've been here 3 quarters, so let's say it's spring quarter, they started in the fall, it's the 10th week of, no, 10th week of quarter would be bad. It's the 5th week of the quarter, and you take 10 students out of a Psych 1 class and buy them lunch. And you ask those 10 students, do you know where you are in your program? Do you know what you have to take to finish? Do you know where you're going after here? How many of those 10 students do you think are going to be able to answer those questions? Yes. 3 is optimistic. It's actually closer to 2 at most colleges, right? They don't know where they are. They don't know where they're going, right? And that's a problem, right? They don't know their paths, right? And before we get too far down this path of they should know, let me share this exercise with you. Try this sometime. In Miami-Dade, first year completion by design, 28 faculty in a room. They were the Guided Pathways Steering Committee for Miami-Dade. We didn't know what the hell we were doing as national partners then. They didn't know what they were doing. This is like 2011. And we had these big ideas. We didn't actually say them this way at that point. We learned how to say them this way. They were really struggling at Miami-Dade. Do these students really need structure? Do they need a clear path? Shouldn't they just be able to figure it out on their own? And by the way, if you ever hear the phrase, when I was a student, we just blank, whatever fills that blank in has a very high likelihood of being bad for low-income students and institutionally racist. Right? When I was a student, we just blank usually is the bootstrapping argument. We just figured it out. We pulled ourselves up. We navigated the system. Okay, cool. Interesting argument. All right. Probably not good for people who have not had a history of navigating educational systems or the first time in college with no social capital, no resources, often coming from bad high schools. Right? But before we even go there, let's talk about what happened at Miami-Dade. So they had these 26 faculty from their 26 largest departments. Miami-Dade, 110,000 undergrads. And they hit an impasse, like middle of fall, third meeting. Half of them said, we do not need structure. They should figure it out. The other half said, we absolutely need structure. And they had hit kind of this impasse. And what happened was, and I found out later, it happened to be the faculty union president who suggested this exercise. Just kind of an interesting backdrop to the story. They asked the biology faculty to leave the room. And they asked the other 27 faculty to design the ideal 2-year pathway to graduate with an AS degree in biology. I almost did it, see? Graduate with an AS degree in biology and transfer with junior standing in the major to Florida International University, which is by far their dominant transfer partner. 70% of their students transfer there. They closed the doors. I picture Game of Thrones, like the doors creaking closed. They're in the dungeon, they're in the room for 27 faculty for 3 hours. They gave them a computer, a catalog, and they gave them the schedule. And they said, go. And when the dungeon doors opened 3 hours later, the epiphany had happened at Miami-Dade College because they couldn't do it. The very task we get preachy and condescending about our first time in college students being able to do, these 27 faculty with an average of 15 years of experience, meaning there are over 400 years of higher education experience in that room, could not complete the task we get preachy and condescending about our students not being able to complete. That was their moment where they realized, okay, I get it. It actually is that hard, right? Their English faculty member was known for saying, I would have had them change their major to English because I would have had a small chance there, right? But it actually is that hard. This clarifying the path idea, and by the way, the clarifying the path with the end in mind, cohort-based CTE programs, the end in mind is I need to do this job, I need to pass a licensure exam. But for your transfer students, 2/3 of your students, what's their end in mind? It's actually not just transfer. It's transfer with junior standing in a major, right? That is not the same thing. You are in one of 47 states with horrible transfer policy. There's only 46 others. So, like, you know very well that if someone's going in psych to Oregon State, Western, or U of O, what they're going to take and apply to junior standing in psychology differs. And your students don't know that, and why would they? They think we actually designed a system that works together. We know the truth. They're actually designed to not work together, right? So that's a big deal. Like, the junior standing with an end is a very different end in mind than just finishing, right? So the paths have to not only include getting through our institution, but if they're transferring, it includes junior standing where they're going. The second one, how do we help students get on a path? Well, that's going to make sure, how do we help them choose programs? How do students choose programs now? Osmosis. You have a lot of accounting majors because it's listed first alphabetically, right? There's not an informed choice about programs. We'll talk later about the idea of maybe the way to choose programs is taking courses for 3 years. That's awesome if you have unlimited time and unlimited resources. And I would still argue, by the way, it doesn't help you actually decide what you want to do with your life. You're taking courses. You're not matching your interests to careers to programs. That's a whole different process, right? That's about getting students on a path. And by the way, if they're taking 5 quarters of Dev Ed, they're also not on the path, right? So the acceleration of Dev Ed matters there too. How do we keep them on the path? How do we intervene? How do we monitor their progress? How do we make sure we're there for them if something goes wrong, which it almost inevitably will, right? You've got 20% of students who are going to succeed no matter what you do. They're my unicorns. You never had 75 of those. Stop telling yourself you did. You've always had 20 out of 100 who are going to succeed no matter what you do. And you've got 10 or 15 who aren't going to succeed no matter what you do, right? And by the way, that group demographically often looks different than the top group, but that group at the bottom does not look different than the middle group of 65 or 70% of your students, right? The group at the bottom, as a parent of a kid with a learning disability, you got a lot of undiagnosed learning disabilities, you have mental health issues, you have ability to benefit issues, you have severe stress in family situations, you have extreme poverty, right? Some of those things are going to lead to your not being able to succeed with the bottom 15. But like I said earlier, if we get to an 80% completion rate, we'll figure out what to do with the bottom 15, right? But that group in the middle, that's where your leverage is. All of this is designed for the group in the middle. It is not designed for the group at the top. They're going to be fine no matter what you do. Change things daily on them, they'll navigate it. And you spend a lot of time with resources at the bottom. Yeah, Jennifer? Was that a 5-minute? We're about at time. Awesome. That's just how I wanted to hear that. All right, what I want to do for you here, really quickly, and because as you guys said, the data is not as convincing as it might be anyway. What I want to show you is there's a series of slides here. Now, you're going to get all these slides. What do these slides show you? They show you the success on those kind of key outcomes that we showed earlier. Like, you guys have had some moderate success, moving them 3 or 4 points. You're seeing double-digit increases. This is the 9 completion by design colleges. This is actually leading up to the first year they implemented guided pathways in fall of 15. So this is like in-progress improvements before they actually even got there. What are you seeing? Across the board, double-digit increases on these metrics we know are inclusive of prediction. You see it, individual colleges, Sinclair in Ohio. Variables like meeting with an advisor has gone up from 23% to 93% because they made it mostly mandatory, right? You can do it. Their enrollment didn't go down when they did that. They made sure that people met with who they needed to meet with. What happened to students completing 9 credit hours in their program in the first year, which, by the way, is also highly predictive of success? That's almost tripled from 12 to 16 because they're trying to get people into programs earlier so they make progress, right? What's happened to their degrees and certificates? You see a pretty big change there. Their iPad's graduation rate was kind of right where yours was a couple of years ago. They're up at 26% now. These aren't, by the way, it's easy to look at these. I want to run through these really quickly. These are easy to look at as graphs or numbers. But these are students' lives, right? If you were at Sinclair and they have 25,000 students and you started in 2011, right, at the moment, only 2,500 of those students would ever complete back in 2011. Now, you're talking about another 3,000 students a year completing. Like, pause there for a second. It's 1,800 because the numbers don't work out perfectly because of cohort sizes. They got 1,800 more completing than they used to. Those are student lives. There's not numbers, right? And again, Sinclair did this without a lot of influx of money. Tennessee, the entire system in Tennessee, which is the best combination of guided pathways reform and Dev Ed reform. Look at the difference on these, like 15 units in a year has gone up 18 points. 12 credits in the first term up 18 points. All these numbers trending strongly up. And this is really where they started their guided pathways work. This is by ethnicity and race. This is showing that there's still gaps, but they've gotten better on earning 24 or more. Just by the way, we'll talk about this in another session, the issue of kind of improvement versus kind of closing gaps. Gateway math and English KPIs, 20-point increases here. You're seeing this across system. Like, you can pick at any of these individual slides from a data standpoint. Collectively, this is like, is it concurrent validity or convergent validity? I taught that class, I should know. When you see 50 studies that are showing a version of the same thing, they can each have one small flaw in it. But if you're saying the same thing across populations, you got to start looking, there's something really here, and there's something that matters. I mean, there's Tennessee's community college 3-year graduation rate, up 42%. They did it in their universities as well, by the way. All their regional 4 years, it went up 26% there. For minority students, it's up 88% for community college and 51% for university. I'll skip, this is a more Cleveland. I'll stop, this is the last one I'll do. Alamo is one of our completion, but it's actually a AACC Pathways College. Check out those, San Antonio is not a rich area. I mean, San Antonio's got a pocket of people who are very rich and a large kind of lower middle class. You're seeing huge, earning 15 college credits in year 1 is up 22 points, doubling the one with 24. This is so important because this tells you their completion rates, whether or not they met the KPI. So if you want to believe this stuff doesn't matter, this is why it matters. Because if you meet 24 or more college credits in year 1, you have a 44% chance of completing within 6 years. It's 6% if you don't. right? So this data clearly matters. So I won't spend a lot more time. You've got all this backdrop here. Again, what are you seeing? Versions of the same trends over and over, moving up. These are all colleges who've worked on pathways, and they're still in their early stages. Indian River in Florida, this is their actual their 2-year graduation rate at Indian River in Florida is now up to overall, it's in the low 30s. That's 2-year. That's not their iPad's 3-year rate, that's their 2-year rate. Florida as a system does very well. This is an Aspen Prize finalist, again, for a lot of this improvement. Lorraine in Ohio, again, we're seeing the upward, that was, by the way, excess units at degree, dropping significantly since 2012-13. I don't love the manipulation of the axis here. That's one of my pet peeves about how this looks like it dropped in half when it, in fact, dropped from 73 to 68. Lies, damn lies, and statistics again. When I was at U of O, I would give my students an assignment, find me a misleading graph. This would be a great example. And then when they struggled with that, because this was kind of pre-internet in 1994, I'd say just go look at any USA Today, which is full of 100% misleading graphs, like where all of a sudden a 1-point difference looks like double. Retention increasing, degrees increasing, iPads rates increasing. Like you're seeing this, I'll finish with this slide. This is their, so you guys I know had a big enrollment slide, right? Struggle was up close to 40%, am I remembering that number, like over a couple year period? Like that's hard. Right? That's people's lives who work at this institution. And that's something that we often think about enrollment management as how do I find more students? This is telling us that may not be the way to think about it for a number of reasons. You're not going to find more students. You've lifted all the rocks in the community at this point. We've got to make sure the students who come here are successful. This is their story from Lorraine in Ohio. That as they improved their retention rate over a 5-year period, this is how many more full-time students retained. Here's their tuition and subsidy. 1.8 million gained in their student success efforts. The mentality of what do we get from students over time matters. And so this data is all a backdrop. I'm going to skip this. And we'll talk a lot more in the afternoon. So all of those colleges who I just showed you with the data, I think all of them, I have slides on what they've done and how you can see it on the web. So what I leave this section of the keynote with is, okay, got it. Stop beating us over the head with it, was Hawaiian shirted dude. We get it. We have a problem. What's the step to any change model you've ever heard of? It doesn't matter. Any 9-step change model that I make fun of constantly. Cotter, it doesn't matter who it is. What was that? Recognize you have a problem, right? I think you should know we have a problem, right? You guys know this, right? By the way, you have a problem on tuition and apportionment, right? Enrollment down that much, you've got a problem, but a completion problem, we have a problem. Right? Why is that problem important? Because of the social justice, equity, economic mobility issues. Do we believe we have agency? You told us, you told me you have agency. You have the ability to affect change. Do you have evidence that the things we're talking about are going to help move the needle on this? I ran through it really quickly, but you got a lot of evidence of that. So you're primed to have these conversations. The last thing I'll say about guided pathways, in case some of you aren't going to be later, this is not implementing someone else's model. I do not have an off-the-shelf model I will give you and say, this is how you do guided pathways. This is design work. You get to be part of the design of how Lane is going to hit those big ideas from the graphic. How are you going to clarify the paths for students? How are you going to get more of them on the path? How are you going to keep them on the path? How are you going to ensure that they're learning? You get to decide that collectively. We can share with you what's happened nationally. Those colleges in my cohort model, I walk them through a process of how to set up work groups to get there. I don't tell them what to do. I can share with you what other colleges have done, but this is your work. And at the end of the day, if you're doing this because an administrator tells you to do it, or you're part of a state project, or Davis Jenkins wrote a book, or some bozo in a Hawaiian shirt said it's a good idea, it's not going anywhere. It has to be a combination of that it's not okay, I care deeply about these students, I care about our community, I care about their outcomes, and I believe we have the agency to control those things in ways that we may not have taken historically. So with that, I say thank you for this first session. I'll see many of you throughout the next 2 days. We'll come back in the afternoon and answer a lot more of your questions, but thank you guys for your time and your energy so far.